Hello and a very warm welcome back to the Crash MotoGP podcast, Season 2, Episode 34, at the start of a brand new season of MotoGP action, the 74th year of the Premier Class, 12 teams, 24 riders and a massive 21 race calendar that starts off in Qatar in a few weeks' time and will end in Valencia come November. And we will be here every single week to keep you hopefully informed and entertained. My name is Harry Benjamin. Alongside me will be Crash MotoGP editor Pete McLaren and former British Championship winning rider turned broadcaster Keith Huewen, plus a myriad of guests throughout the year. Now, before we dive in to all things MotoGP, we're back for another season. Keith, Pete, pleasure to be alongside you as ever. Looking forward to this season so far. It's got all the makings. It's going to be another cracker, Keith.
It's already been going on, hasn't it? There's so many rumours flying around already. And we've just had our big signing on Monday as well, with Bagnaia now signed up for another 2 years in 23 and 24. And I think that just goes to show, the reason I've jumped straight in there right at the beginning of our conversation regarding that is I think that gives some indication of how intense this year is going to be and moving forward. We've had that slight changing of the guard, haven't we, with Rossi out. I mean, Valentino Rossi, almost I feel like, who's he? It's really strange that we've only been minutes since he retired, and it's like he's fell off the edge of the cliff, and very few people are talking about him. Quite right, of course, because he's yesterday's man now. But what an interesting scenario we've got. Enea Bastianini going good in the tests as well. That little bit of changing of the guard, the Ducati shapeshifter, which again, technology is running wild. Is it the right way to go? Isn't it the right way to go? We're talking about a prototype series, of course, in MotoGP. So therefore, I quite like the idea of all these innovations, but there's got to be the cost factor and whether it's ever going to be used on road bikes or somewhere in the future. So there's a lot to discuss this year, not to mention, COVID now receding in the way that it seems to be in most places, most markets around the world as well, is that some of these trips that they've got coming up, I mean, the gaps between Qatar and Indonesia, for instance, massive flights to get to and from these Grand Prix. It's going to be an absolutely, there's only one word I can use, knackering year. Everybody's going to be worn out by halfway through the year. And I think that's going to be a factor this year as well.
I'm exhausted just from hearing you say all of that. And I'm not flying to all of them. But again, we will be here for every single weekend as well. And as you say, Keith, the start of the season isn't right, really, without pre-season testing, which, of course, for the first time has just finished the new Mandalika circuit in Indonesia. Pete, still trapped in Thailand. This was the first time we and the riders, I suppose, really got a glimpse at the kind of machinery and the fairings and the winglets of everything coming on for the start of the season. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what went down? And then, Keith wants to speak.
Let me just stop you there for a second. Trapped in Thailand. Such hardship that you have, Peter, I must say.
I was just looking at people who watch this on our YouTube channel, which make sure you subscribe to the Crash MotoGP YouTube channel. It just always looks a little bit, I don't know, the wall just looks a bit drab behind you, Pete. It's not too dissimilar from a prison cell. Apart from the picture, obviously, on the wall. But either side, it's just a bit drab. But either way, it's always a pleasure to have you on board. How is Thailand, first of all? And then can you talk us through a little bit of testing as well and all the things you picked up from the last couple of weeks?
Well, first of all, obviously, it started off in Malaysia, which is right next door to Thailand. But unfortunately, as we mentioned previously, getting into Malaysia and the restrictions at the test were pretty intense. So, restrictions are easing in many parts of the world, particularly Europe, but certainly in Southeast Asia, it's still, the rules around getting into the country, especially for MotoGP, people had to stay in one of two hotels. You basically had to go from the hotel to the track and back, and that's it. Lots of testing. MotoGP's been really careful to keep the governments on side. They're being very cautious. They don't, they're not perhaps as confident as in Europe and other places of just opening up again. So we're still seeing a lot of restrictions over here, and that's it's a good thing that the tests went ahead without problem. But as Keith says, you've got a lot of travel. You still got at the moment this problem of if you're a rider and you fail one of these seemingly endless tests before one of your flights, you could miss a race. And that's something that a lot of the riders spoke about during testing. It's not obviously the obvious thing, you talk about the speed and the bikes, but it's something that's hanging over them. One of the most tense parts of a race weekend will probably be getting the first, PCR test result that says you can actually get on the plane and even go to the race. And with all of these races so close together, the chances of that happening are bigger and bigger. So while perhaps the risk of getting a serious illness has thankfully receded, at the moment there's still restrictions as far as passing tests to get into countries, to get access to the track. And while that exists, there's going to be a lot of tense, moments for the riders. We saw team members that couldn't go to all of the tests, either couldn't leave Europe or couldn't go on from Malaysia to the Indonesian test. So it's still a delicate situation, I think you could say. It's still not situation normal for the World Championship. But let's hope that and some of the riders were saying this, that maybe it's time for, now everybody's vaccinated and things like that, and that maybe hopefully the paddock can return to more normality, and that risk of missing races just because you fail a test will recede. Now, getting onto the actual track action, I think, as you guys have said, basically to sum it up, it's close. I think we were worried. Keith was speaking last year. We were both speaking about the end of this technical freeze. Will somebody get a big advantage? Something they've had in the pipeline. Will the gaps get bigger? To be honest, from what we've seen in testing, not at all. Everything's just as close, if not closer. We've seen the top sort of almost 20 riders within 1 second. Also on race pace, even average pace, it's been top 10 within half a second. So 5 different bikes regularly in the top 6. Close as you like. So there's been, at the moment, it's as open as ever. We've seen the full range of developments as far as big changes at Honda, also at Ducati, Aprilia, Suzuki have surprised with the number of changes they've got. KTM have gone for a completely different approach of sort of pinpointing small detailed changes on their current bike to try and really understand sort of what they need from the bike. You saw Yamaha. I mean, if you ask Quartararo, the word he uses is the same. Now, he doesn't mean literally, but that gives you an idea of just how little that bike has changed. So you've got the whole range of things. And yet when you put all that together on track and in 2 different tracks, the lap times are incredibly close.
But I think you need a word of caution there, Pete, don't you, really? With all of these tests, 90% humidity in Sepang, that's not normal. A track breaking up in Mandalika, that's not normal. You've got a situation where these times that are done, and I agree with you, it looks ever so tight when you look at lap times and the like, and you look at sheets. But in a real-time situation where you've got motorbikes travelling on the track at the same time in a race, you've got a Ducati that's still 8 to 10 mile an hour faster than anything else in a straight line, which means that into a braking area, you're always going to have a Ducati underneath you going in there. So it's going to mess up that perfect lap that the Yamaha might be on because the Yamaha is still slow. The point being is that in a race situation, test times don't always equate to results. It's not a situation where you can get a bit of a, I think it's wonderful that Aprilia are right in the action with both Vinales, who we know always goes good at testing at the beginning of the year and then falls away as the rest of the year comes on. Hopefully that won't be the case for him again this year, but I suspect it will be. Aleix Espargaro, we know how quick he is over a one-lap wonder type shot. So we're in that situation. The big standout for me was Enea Bastianini, who carried on his trajectory, if you like, in the upward momentum. Luca Marini looked good as well in his testing. So there are 1 or 2 bright spots that are going on in MotoGP, but I'm always massively sceptical, and I just don't believe that these couple of tests that they've had are indicative of that much as we start to move on into proper racing terms. I mean, Qatar is an oddball race anyway. Track's always clean, which is lucky. It's amazing considering it's in the middle of a desert, but it's not anymore because the city's caught up with the track now. It used to be in the middle of the desert. Now it's being swamped by buildings. But the point being is that Qatar are different because of the temperatures and the dew point in the evening when the lights come on and so on and so forth. It's a bit of an odd one. And then, of course, Indonesia. Have they got much in the way of data? I don't think they have. They had a 1 metre line. Now, that's another thing that's going to be an almighty cock-up when we get to Indonesia. They could only work on 1 metre or 2 metres of racetrack because the track was in such disgusting order. Even Argentina, that is quite often muddy and dirty when we first get there, cleans up reasonably well. But the Indonesian track didn't clean up at all, and they didn't seem to have the wherewithal to be able to get it cleaned up. And then we had rocks that were coming out of it. They said, well, we've never had that before. And then Chaz Davies, boom, smashes them in the teeth to say that, yes, we did. When we were out there for the World Superbikes, we had the same problem with World Superbikes breaking the track up. Apparently, they didn't use the stones in the mix of tarmac. I know nothing about tarmac, so please don't shoot me down. Didn't use the right mix of stones that they would have had to have imported. They used something local. It hasn't bonded as well as it should have bonded. And with the power of these bikes through such a small area, is spitting the rocks out. And you only had to look at the riders. I mean, you mentioned it, Harry, before we came on air. great big spatter marks. And in Kota, we had, when they diamond cut the top of the surface, we had all that dust, which sort of shot blasted the bikes and didn't do your lungs a lot of good and all the rest of it. You're breathing in cement dust or concrete or whatever it is that comes up from rocks. And then we get to Mandalika and they're chucking dirty, great big rocks through the windscreen at you. I mean, it makes you wonder what these people think like sometimes. I mean, I really don't get it. And how they're going to fix that with the timescale they've got. What was it, 5 weeks between that test and when we go there for the race? They're not going to be able to do anything in that time. They're going to sweep it clean, and we're probably going to have this problem when we get there. Hopefully the line will be wider. Again, it comes back down to testing. You can all go around single file, put your quick lap in on a track that's cleaning up. But the second you've got 24 motorbikes side by side down into turn one, and you've got the bit in the middle's got the grip and everywhere else hasn't, going to be a problem.
This is that is the main talking point that has come out of testing, isn't it, Pete? Because it seems like 25% of the track needs resurfacing. I think Alex Marquez said turn one, it's almost like a completely different tarmac. And as Keith alluded to there, it's the 20th of March is the day of the Grand Prix, but it needs to be completed before that. How much of a worry is that going to be for not just the riders, but the organisers too, to get this track up to standard?
I mean, there were rumours that the race might be delayed. So that was how sort of seriously this issue was being taken. And they've said, look, we are going to keep to the date. It's going to be done a minimum of a week before. But I mean, that's, as you guys have been saying, that's sort of a one-shot chance, isn't it? That means they're going to have to get it spot on first time with this resurfacing. And I mean, data-wise, obviously the big purpose of the test really was to give Michelin data for the tyres. Well, I mean, whether there was any meaningful data with such an amount of dirt on the track anyway is up for debate. But now there's going to be 25% of it that they won't have ridden before. I mean, what will that do? But in fairness, we've seen problems with the surface, haven't we, at other tracks? We've seen, obviously, Silverstone had drainage problems. We've seen Kota, they've resurfaced. We've seen Sepang when they had the drainage issues. So, this kind of thing does happen. But you are surprised that Keith brings the example up of Chaz Davies, that they had a race last year, and yet that's when it seemed the perfect sort of scenario. Send World Superbike. They get their first, they get the honour of the first race on this track, but also it should spot any issues like this, shouldn't it? And yet here we are, we come to the test and suddenly, it's a big problem, clearly. And it's a problem that needs this emergency sort of resurfacing. So it's not ideal. And obviously it's not just the track surface. There's a lot of building work going on around the track. When you look at sort of satellite images, you can see how quickly the area around the track is changing. Houses that were there are not there anymore and things like that. And this is where all this dirt and dust seems to be coming from. But you had the extraordinary situation on the first day of riders being told to go and clean the track. Now, I mean, I can't ever remember that happening, actually ordering riders to do, I think they had to do 20 laps each by a certain time. And some riders were kind of fine with it. Well, hey, that's the best way to clean it. And others were really unhappy about it and pointing out, look, different bikes handle differently in those kind of conditions anyway, sort of low grip anyway. Saying, look, I shouldn't be ordered to do this. So, I mean, it was a strange test. That's how it started. And then it finished with these problems with the track breaking up. So, yeah, a strange test. And as you say, how do you draw any conclusions from it? You can't really. What it means is that we go into Qatar, and to be honest, it'll be a real opening round. Now, what do I mean by that? Usually we've had testing, haven't we? We've had testing at Qatar 3 days, 5 days, 6 days. They know the track by the back of their hand. They turn up for Friday practice. They've got a setup. They pretty much know which race tire they're going to use. It's fine tuning. This year, it's starting from scratch. And Keith says Bastianini. You've got Bastianini. He'll turn up at Qatar. He can bolt on, if you like, the setup that Pecco Bagnaia used, Johan Zarco, Jorge Martin, 3 guys that were on the podium last year. And he's got a really good starting point with that bike, where the other guys with newer bikes could, they've got to start from scratch and have a completely green, or in the case of Qatar, sort of dusty, sandy coloured track that's going to be changing throughout the weekend.
Forget about the riders. Think about the techs. I mean, those guys went there to get data. I mean, data is everything, particularly when it's as tight as it is at the moment, and they've got nothing. And it's not just a case of cleaning the track. I mean, they did, right, the riders had to go around. How many times have we had, how many millions of pounds worth of track cleaners was that, I wonder? If you consider rider wages and the cost of the motorcycles that they were using as track cleaners. You do get it sometimes to run a groove in a track, I suppose. Sepang, sometimes in the test, the first day is all about just, installation laps, if you like, more than anything, and the track cleans up and it evolves into something that's a bit more like it. Doesn't help when they've run a Ferrari corporate day there the week before and there's rubber everywhere and junk all over the track. It happens. But Mandalika, I've got to say, is this denial situation that you end up quite often. I mean, you being in Thailand, Pete, will be susceptible. I mean, obviously, I've got a fairly heavyweight Asian connection, so I won't speak too badly. But face and loss of face is a major issue in Asia generally, and somebody somewhere has lost a bit of face over the fact that this track is not in the order it should be in, and therefore the buck has probably gone all the way around the offices to try and find a way out of this. As an example, I remember sitting in a bank once, checking my bank statement in the middle of Thailand, as it turned out, and there was like sort of 1,000 baht missing out of my bank account. And the bank closed, and I was sat in the bank foyer for an hour after closing. Imagine doing this in the UK, while these people hid behind the counter, and every now and again the manager would pop his head over. They couldn't find the 1,000 baht. What it was taken in a fee, as it turns out in the end. But the whole bank wouldn't close until this lunatic had left the building. And that's the situation you're up against. Somebody has to take responsibility for what's happened. And despite the fact they knew it in World Superbikes from last year, and Chaz Davies was very, very straightforward in the fact that they had been given that information from the World Superbikes last year that the track was breaking up. Point being, you can't sweep that clean. You can sweep the rocks off, but if they just keep reappearing, if the surface is breaking up, as we're told it is, I haven't been to Mandalika, so I don't know anything about it other than what I've read and who I've spoken to. But the track surface was breaking up. In fact, Pete, we talked about it before we came on air, didn't we? You mentioned that they never even ran the practice starts until late on, so it didn't cause any track damage while they were still testing. So, and when they run the track starts, I mean, those motorbikes launch now like racing cars. They spit like mad junk out the back. They've got so much grip and forward motion that the track breaks up in places. Now, are they going to be able to fix that in 5 weeks? If they can fix it, as Harry said, the week up to the week before, it should be ready. You've still got the oils that are going to be coming out. Again, it depends on the mix they've put in it. Where is it? Has it been a local mix? Has it been a something that they've imported to try and get it right? So many questions. And when you've got all of this, I mean, it's a big deal for them in Indonesia and a big deal for Dorna. Dorna have been trying to get back to Indonesia for a long time. It's a massive market. And that is a place they want to be. Nobody wants to cause trouble for the track or for the organisers or for the country, but it's got to be right.
I mean, just to say, one of the issues, or one of the areas that's being repaved is that start-finish straight. That's part. It's coming from the sort of the final corner to about corner 5 or 6, I think it is. So, because the issue they had as well with the practice starts was that the bikes were spinning up. That's how slippy it was, because the position of the grid is a long way from the final corner, so it wasn't being cleaned. And they were saying, look, if you qualified on pole position, you'd actually be in a real disadvantage if the race occurred. So, yeah, they had the practice starts actually sort of moved them to lunchtime on the final day, and then there was this sort of circuit inspection. So it told you that there was something not right, and then subsequently the announcement comes out about the resurfacing. But, I mean, on the other side of the coin, the riders said the track is very safe, as in the layout. They like the layout of it. The gravel traps are great. Luca Marini said there's 2 or 3 corners that are some of the best in the world. So a few guys said it was a bit short, but so in terms of the layout, in credit to them, the riders liked it. They said it's safe. The walls are plenty far enough away, but they've clearly got, the clock's ticking to solve the surface issue for this first race. And then who knows about the weather, as we saw, that you can have, as with the Superbike event, some big storms there. And it's just another thing, isn't it, to add to the equation. So yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty in general going into this first race in Qatar, given everything that's happened. Only 2 days, of course, at Sepang. Sepang is a circuit without much uncertainty, if you like, in that the teams and riders all know it really well. It's got a good mix of corners, everything's stable, but they only had 2 days there, not the usual 3. There's a lot that they still need to find out about these bikes going into this first race.
Well, we will certainly.
And yet it was Ducati again that came up with the business, wasn't it? Ducati and their shapeshifter. I mean, that just Gigi Dall'Igna. What's in that man's head?
I once asked him, where does he get these ideas? I said, do you sort of wake up in the night and write them down, or what?
Of course. I mean, like But he looks like one of these mad professors. If you saw him in one of these Hitchcock films or whatever, he'd be right in place, wouldn't he? But it's because our rule book, and again, Harry, I know that you've been involved with race car rule books, which are like sort of volume 10 and this thick, whereas it's still our rule book for MotoGP and technical regs and stuff is still quite small, which I think is wonderful because it gives that opportunity still to make those slight changes. I suppose it's just annoying for most of the factories that it's Ducati that seems to always lead the way on innovation, and that's not lost on them.
It's funny though, Keith, isn't it? Because ever since the rear whole shot device turned into a ride height device, by which we just mean it can be used around the track, isn't it? The clock was always ticking on the front, wasn't it? I mean, it's the natural evolution. And yet again, as you say, it's Ducati that do it first. We have that video that comes out from Pirro at the shakedown test of him doing the practice start. And you clearly see he presses one button, doesn't he? One switch, and both the front and back go down. As soon as you saw that, it was immediately, they can do that around the lap. Because it's we know from past experience of how these ride height systems, to whole shot to ride height, that's how it goes. And then you're on a hunt for pictures, aren't you? We were lucky we had Hazrin, local photographer at Sepang, who people might not know, but he took one of the most famous pictures in MotoGP, the one from 2015 of Rossi looking over his shoulder out of the penultimate corner at Marquez on the floor. That was by Hazrin. He's been, he's part of the furniture at Sepang, and he asked if we wanted any particular pictures from the test. We got Golden Goose there, our usual photography suppliers doing all the usual stuff. So I said, yeah, what a photo feature on ride height devices, whole shot devices. So he was photographing those, and he sent over, as we say, we're all looking for this lowered Ducati, because after we've seen Pirro start, we know it's there. So we're all looking for it on track. Hazrin sends the pictures, and then just to rewind a couple of years, when the Yamaha first came out with the rear whole shot device, I was at Sepang for the shakedown, took some pictures, and it looked like the front went down. And I thought, are they moving the front as well? So I went to some senior tech people in the paddock. What do you think? And they were kind of like, well, it kind of looks like it does, but to be honest, it's deceptive because of the different sort of angles and pitches that the bikes have. But the person there told me, and this is where it came back 2 years later, he said, the way you tell is this: take a picture of the suspension in pit lane, the normal position of the front fork, compare the position, the gold bit, if you like, to speak in layman's terms, that you can see at the bottom of the fork leg. Take a picture of that when they do the start and compare the difference. And that's conclusive. Don't get caught up in bodywork, wheels, because if it's a different angle, it'll look different. That's the conclusive proof. So there we are. We're looking at these pictures. To be honest, the factory Ducati, it was like Hazrin, it's not much different. Anyway, and credit to him, he came back a day later and he had those pictures of Zarco, which was the dream scenario. Same rider, same corner, ride height device on, ride height device off. And you could clearly see that with the ride height device on, the front suspension was still compressed, even with the front wheel off the ground. And so that sort of was the conclusive proof that they are running this system already. So as Keith says, another gizmo for the other factories to catch up with.
Well, that's...
Or not, because I think... Sorry, Harry, I know you keep trying to get in on this. But... you sound like a stuttering two-stroke.
Hey, no, you keep on talking.
The fact of the matter is, though, they might only be able to use this. The cost involved in that development for something they may only have for a year, because at the end of the day, it could be bad. They can use it this year if it's within the rules. But I think next year, if my memory serves me right regarding the rule book, if it's outlawed for the coming year, it could be outlawed this year, but they because they've done it within the rules, it stays. But next year it could be out. So it's a very costly situation to get to. It's the development that costs the money, not the actual production of the kit to make it work. That's relatively cheap in comparison, but developing this stuff costs a lot of money. And Ducati obviously have a lot of money.
It was interesting, Keith, because we obviously asked Sahara-san, the head of the Suzuki project, did a media debrief before the Indonesian test, and he was asked about, have you got a system like this under development? And he said no, and he pretty much said that they're not planning one for this year. And sort of, if you're a rider, it's not quite what you want to hear, is it? When someone comes out with a gizmo, you want to hear, oh yeah, we've got one of those just ready, But anyway, because there are rumours about, as you say, does it fit entirely within the rules? Ducati have been pretty clear, and you've got to say they wouldn't be running it unless they were confident. We had Danny Aldridge on the show explaining how he checks now, doesn't he? He's got this more complicated system, a clear system. Take all the power sources off the bike, show him how it works, everything else. So you've got to believe that it will pass all of the checks. But yeah, it sounds like Suzuki are in no rush. And but as a rider, do you want to hear that? I don't know.
Probably why Bagnaia signed for another 2 years then.
Well,
he's getting ahead of the curve.
A perfect segue, I think, to talking about that signing, which literally just broke